Single mum forced to pretend to be mother to Arab millionaire's 8 kids at luxury yacht party. Then he invites her to his room and says, "Sleep with me." 3 months later, she turns up pregnant, and they discover that... Comment giving a rating from 0 to 10. For my story, your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I count on your help. The morning started like any other for the 30-year-old single mom, racing against the clock between her small apartment in the suburbs and the event planning company in the city's harbour district. Her hurried footsteps echoed through the hallway as she carried her 4-year-old daughter, a child who looked barely 2 due to the frailty caused by a rare medical condition that consumed almost her entire monthly income. Her boss was waiting for her with an expression she knew well, that mix of urgency and opportunity that meant more work and possibly more money. The company had landed the most important contract in its history, organizing a birthday party on the luxury yacht of the most influential Arab millionaire in the city. At 30, he had built an empire in the import of spices and fine fabrics, amassing a fortune that seemed limitless. She was assigned as the main event coordinator, a responsibility that made her tremble inside, not only because of the weight of the task, but also because of the opportunity to earn enough to pay for her daughter's next round of treatment. The man had 8 children from previous relationships, kids between 4 and 16 who would be present at the celebration along with important international investors. On the day of the party, she arrived at the harbour before dawn to oversee every detail. The yacht was a floating work of art with 3 decks of pure luxury that reflected its owner's wealth, exotic flowers, gold arrangements, and decorations that cost more than her annual salary transformed the environment into something out of a fairy tale. The millionaire appeared as the sun painted the sky orange, wearing a suit that cost more than her rent. His movie star looks contrasted with the distant and calculating gaze of someone accustomed to commanding financial empires. He greeted her with the typical coldness of someone who sees employees as mere cogs in a machine. Everything was going perfectly until, an hour before the guests arrived, the nanny responsible for the 8 children began to feel ill. The woman, a 60-year-old hired specifically for the event, had a sudden drop in blood pressure and needed to be rushed to the hospital. Despair took over the millionaire when he realized he would have to cancel the event that would bring together investors capable of multiplying his fortune. That's when his eyes turned to her, who was watching the scene while coordinating the final preparations. Without many options, he approached her with an unexpected proposal, that she temporarily take care of the children, pretending to be the family's new governess for the entire party. The offer came with a sum of money that would make all the difference in her daughter's treatment. She hesitated for only a few seconds. Need spoke louder than fear, and she accepted the proposal that would completely change the course of that night, and without her knowing it, of her entire life. She quickly traded her work uniform for an elegant dress that he had fetched from a nearby boutique, transforming herself into the perfect governess to fool the eyes of the guests. The children arrived accompanied by private drivers, 8 little ones who carried in their eyes a mixture of rebellion and longing. The oldest, a 16-year-old girl, analyzed her with suspicion, while the younger ones ran around the yacht as if it were an amusement park. She had to use all her experience as a mother to establish order without seeming authoritarian. As the first guests began to arrive, she realized that she had gotten into something much bigger than she imagined. Men and women wearing clothes that cost small fortunes circulated around the yacht, discussing business in various languages. The millionaire moved among them with the ease of someone born into that world, closing deals that moved millions, while she made sure that his children didn't interfere with the negotiations. During the party, something unexpected happened. The children, accustomed to professional but distant nannies, became attached to her in a surprising way. Her warm way of dealing with each tantrum, each request for attention, each moment of stubbornness, awakened in the little ones a trust they had not felt in a long time. She was not just another employee following orders. She was someone who really cared about their well-being. The millionaire, busy with his business, began to notice how his children were different. The genuine smile on the face of the 4-year-old youngest, the way the 8-year-old son stopped throwing tantrums, and especially how they all seemed to gravitate around that woman who had emerged from nowhere in their lives. For the first time in years, he saw his children truly happy in the presence of a female figure. As the party came to an end and the last guest said goodbye, she prepared to return to her reality. The children, exhausted but reluctant to part with her, were being taken by the drivers back to their respective homes and boarding schools. The yacht, which a few hours ago was teeming with life and business, now breathed an almost melancholy tranquility. He approached her when they were alone on the main deck, with the sound of the waves crashing against the hull and the city lights reflecting in the dark water. For a moment, the mask of the ruthless businessman fell, and she saw in his eyes something she did not expect to find: vulnerability. The night had been a financial success, but it had also awakened in him feelings that he had kept buried for years since his ex-wife betrayed him in a devastating way. The conversation that followed was different from any interaction they had had during the day. He spoke about the loneliness of raising 8 children practically alone, about how money never managed to fill the void left by the lack of a true companion. She, in turn, shared her own wounds, the daily struggle to support her sick daughter, the dreams she had to abandon, the constant feeling of sinking financially. At that moment, something invisible but powerful settled between them. The tension that had been growing throughout the day, disguised as professionalism and responsibility, finally found space to manifest. When he invited her to stay, it was not just physical desire that moved them, but a deep emotional connection that neither of them had felt in a long time. The night that followed on the yacht was like a dream she never dared to imagine. Between intimate conversations about past wounds and lost dreams, they connected in a way that surprised them both. He spoke about the betrayal that destroyed his ability to trust, about how he built walls around his heart to protect not only himself, but also his children. She shared the constant fear of not being able to save her own daughter, of failing as a mother for not having enough resources to pay for all the necessary treatments. When they finally surrendered to each other, it was not just physical passion that united them, but a deep need for human connection that both had denied for years. For the first time since becoming a single mother, she felt complete, as if all the pieces of her fragmented life finally fit together. He, in turn, experienced a sense of peace that money and all his investments in stocks and assets could never provide. The next morning, reality knocked on the door like an unexpected storm. She needed to go back home, to her daughter, who had spent the night with the elderly neighbor, and to the arduous routine of work and endless medical appointments. He drove her to the harbor in his imported car, a heavy silence hanging between them. Both knew that that night had been a magical parenthesis in their complex lives, but neither knew how to turn that into something lasting. The days that followed were a silent torture. She returned to her responsibilities at the event planning company, organizing smaller parties and trying not to think about the feeling of belonging she had experienced on the yacht. Every time the phone rang, her heart leaped with the hope that it was him, but the calls were always about work or related to her daughter's treatment. He, in turn, tried to focus on his business, closing multi-million-dollar deals and expanding his imports to new international markets. But his children constantly asked about the woman who had cared for them so lovingly on that special night. The governess he hired to replace her was efficient and experienced, but cold as marble. The children obeyed, but the genuine sparkle that he had seen in their eyes at that party had completely disappeared. 2 months passed in an emotional limbo for both. She continued to work tirelessly, accumulating overtime to cover the rising costs of her daughter's treatment, whose condition seemed to be slowly stabilizing. He delved even deeper into work, acquiring new properties and diversifying his investments, as if material wealth could fill the void he felt in his chest. It was then that fate decided to intervene in the most unexpected way possible. One morning, as she was getting ready for another day of work, she realized that something was different in her body. The initial symptoms seemed to be the result of stress and irregular eating, but when her period didn't come for the second time, a terrible suspicion began to take shape in her mind. The positive pregnancy test left her completely paralyzed in the bathroom of her small apartment. How would she explain to her 4-year-old daughter, who could barely understand why she needed to take so many medications, that she would now have a brother or sister? How would she support 2 children with the salary that barely covered her current expenses? And most importantly, how would she tell him about this pregnancy that would change everything? For weeks, she kept the secret, trying to find the courage to do what she knew was necessary. But fate would not wait for her decision. A co-worker who had noticed her morning sickness and mood swings ended up finding out about the pregnancy during a casual conversation in the company bathroom. The news spread through the corridors like wildfire. When the information reached the millionaire's ears, he felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. His first reaction was blind rage. How many women over the years had tried to pull scams using children as bargaining chips? His fortune attracted people willing to do anything to secure a share of his wealth. His ex-wife's betrayal had left deep scars that now seemed to reopen. Without thinking about the consequences or even confirming the facts, he went directly to the event planning company. He confronted her publicly, in front of all her colleagues, accusing her of being just another opportunist, trying to take advantage of a night of weakness. The words that came out of his mouth were like sharp knives, cutting not only her dignity, but also any possibility of explanation. The humiliation was devastating. She tried to defend herself, to explain that she never intended to blackmail him or ask for anything, but his anger was a hurricane that allowed no room for reason. The boss, concerned about maintaining good relations with such an important client, did not hesitate to fire her on the spot. In a matter of minutes, she lost not only her job, but also any chance of keeping her dignity intact. She returned home devastated, carrying a box with her personal belongings and the crushing weight of rejection. Her 4-year-old daughter immediately realized that something terrible had happened and began to cry, without understanding why. That night she found herself forced to face a brutal reality. She was pregnant, unemployed, and still needed to care for a child who depended on expensive treatments to survive. The financial situation, which was already precarious, became desperate. The savings she had put together for her daughter's next round of treatment would now need to be used for basic expenses such as rent and food. Despair led her to accept any job opportunity, no matter how humiliating. She got a job as a cleaner in a commercial building downtown, working double shifts to try to generate a minimum income. The changes in routine and the emotional stress of the mother deeply affected the 4-year-old daughter. The child, already weakened by her medical condition, began to show worrying symptoms: loss of appetite, sleepless nights, and a constant sadness in the eyes that once shone with innocence. Doctors warned that her emotional state could significantly worsen her clinical picture. During the months that followed, she turned into a shadow of herself. She woke up before dawn to clean empty offices, returned home only to care for her daughter and prepare for another night of work in another building. Her belly grew slowly, constantly reminding her of the magical night that now seemed like a distant nightmare. He in turn tried to convince himself that he had made the right decision, but his children didn't stop asking about that special woman who had cared for them with so much love. The eldest daughter, a clever 16-year-old, began to ask uncomfortable questions about the whereabouts of the former governess. Her suspicions grew with each passing day, fueled by the drastic change in her father's behavior after that mysterious confrontation. The millionaire's eldest daughter was not like other 16-year-olds. Growing up in a business environment had sharpened her perception and developed an investigative instinct that made her question everything around her. The changes in her father's behavior, added to the sudden disappearance of the only woman who had awakened genuine joy in her younger siblings, created a mystery that she was determined to solve. For weeks, the teenager watched her father delve deeper and deeper into business, closing multi-million-dollar deals as if work could anesthetize some invisible pain. She noticed how he avoided any conversation about the yacht party, changing the subject whenever the children mentioned that special night. Her siblings, especially the younger ones, had lost the sparkle in their eyes and returned to their rebellious behavior. The current governess was technically perfect, punctual, organized, efficient in all practical aspects of childcare, but there was a coldness in her interactions that contrasted drastically with the maternal affection that everyone had experienced on that single night. The children obeyed out of discipline, not affection, and this was reflected in a tense and lifeless home environment. Determined to discover the truth, the teenager began her own investigation. She gained access to her father's files on the event, discovering the name of the company responsible for the organization. A discreet call revealed that the main coordinator had been abruptly fired a few months ago, but a sympathetic employee provided vague information about her possible whereabouts. The search took weeks, but finally she discovered where the woman worked, as a night cleaner in a commercial building downtown. The discovery was a shock that left her speechless. How could someone who had demonstrated so much competence and caring have fallen into such a degrading situation? What connection existed between that sudden fall and her father's strange behavior? On a cold winter night, the teenager lied about her plans and asked the driver to take her downtown. She arrived at the commercial building around 10 at night, when she knew the cleaning shift would be in progress. What she found left her completely devastated. The woman she remembered as elegant and full of life was now unrecognizable, too thin, with deep dark circles under her eyes that betrayed sleepless nights, wearing a shabby cleaning uniform that couldn't hide her pregnant belly. But what shocked the teenager most was seeing a 4-year-old child sitting in a corner of the lobby, visibly ill, waiting for her mother to finish work. The little girl coughed constantly, her pale skin contrasting with her big, sad eyes that seemed much larger than her thin face. It was evident that her condition had deteriorated significantly, probably due to stress and the precarious conditions in which they lived. The sight of that child suffering while her mother worked exhaustively to support the family deeply touched the teenager's heart. When the woman finally noticed her, the recognition was instant and devastating. The embarrassment of being seen in that situation by one of the children she had cared for so lovingly was almost unbearable. She tried to compose herself, forcing a smile that couldn't hide the deep pain in her eyes. The teenager approached slowly, as if fearing that any sudden movement could break the woman who was visibly on the verge of collapse. The conversation that followed was marked by heavy silences and restrained tears. The teenager learned about the firing, the pregnancy, the growing financial difficulties, but mainly discovered about the deterioration of the little girl's health. The child needed treatments that cost a fortune, money that simply didn't exist in a cleaner's budget. At that moment, all the pieces of the puzzle fell into place in the teenager's sharp mind. The chronology of the firing coinciding with the change in her father's behavior, the pregnancy that explained the apparent belly, and mainly the glaring injustice of seeing such a special woman reduced to that desperate situation. Her indignation grew like a storm, fueled by the certainty that her father was directly responsible for that tragedy. The return home was a silent torment. The teenager spent the entire night awake, planning how she would confront her father with the reality he was trying to ignore. It wasn't just about justice, but about saving a family that didn't deserve to be suffering that way. The next morning, she waited for him in the private office of the mansion, armed with all the information she had collected. The confrontation was explosive. She described in detail everything she had seen. The pregnant woman working as a cleaner, the visibly ill child waiting in the cold corridors, and mainly the injustice of such a caring person having been reduced to that situation. Each word was like a stone thrown at the millionaire's conscience, who tried to defend himself, claiming protection against opportunists. The teenager didn't accept the justifications. With the calculating coldness she had inherited from her father, she presented logical and emotional arguments that demolished all his defenses. If the woman was really an opportunist, she would have sought lawyers or tried to blackmail the family. Instead, she was working in humiliating conditions to support two daughters, one of them clearly sick and the other still in the womb. The pressure intensified when she threatened to tell all the truth to her younger siblings, explaining why the woman they loved so much had disappeared from their lives. The image that her father was trying to maintain as a fair man and protector of the family would completely collapse before the eyes of the children he loved most. For days, the millionaire resisted his daughter's accusations, trying to maintain his version of the facts. But her words echoed constantly in his mind, especially during the lonely nights when the weight of guilt became unbearable. The other children began to notice the tension between father and older sister, creating an increasingly unstable home environment. The last straw came when he learned through contacts in the medical area that a child with the same profile described by his daughter was on the waiting list for an urgent transplant. The coincidence haunted him for days, making him realize that he might be ignoring a situation much more serious than he had imagined. The possibility that an innocent child could die because of his stubbornness began to corrode his conscience relentlessly. The wealth he had accumulated over the years, the investments in stocks that multiplied his assets, the properties scattered throughout the city, none of that seemed to have any meaning in the face of the possibility of having contributed to the suffering of an innocent child. For the first time since his ex-wife's betrayal, he began to question whether his need for protection had turned into unnecessary cruelty. It was then that he made the decision that would change everything. He would personally verify the situation that his daughter had described, not to apologize or assume responsibility, but simply to confirm with his own eyes whether his actions had really caused as much damage as his conscience was beginning to suggest. The decision to face reality led the millionaire to the commercial building on a particularly cold night. He arrived discreetly, observing from a distance before approaching. What he saw confirmed every word that his daughter had said, but the reality was even more brutal than his imagination had managed to conceive. She was there, wearing the cleaner's uniform, with her pregnant belly more prominent than he had expected, but it was the sight of the little daughter that hit him like a punch in the chest. The 4-year-old child was sitting on an improvised chair, wrapped in a thin blanket, clearly struggling against a persistent cough that made her thin body contract with each spasm. When she finally noticed him, the shock in her eyes was devastating. There was no anger, just a deep sadness and a resignation that made him realize how completely he had destroyed not only her life, but also any hope she might have nurtured about him. The woman who had once made him feel complete now looked at him as if he were a dangerous stranger. The conversation was painful and full of heavy silences. He tried to explain himself, to talk about his fears of being deceived again, but the words sounded empty in the face of the reality before him. She didn't attack him verbally, didn't scream or accuse him. She simply explained, with an haunting calm, how she had been fired, how she had found that job to survive, and mainly how her daughter's health was deteriorating rapidly. It was then that she revealed something that left him completely devastated. The child urgently needed a transplant, and doctors had found only a few possible compatible donors in the region. The waiting list was long, and the chances of getting an organ in time were decreasing every day. Without the proper treatment, which she simply couldn't afford, the girl wouldn't have much time. At that moment, something inside him broke definitively. It wasn't just guilt for what he had done, but the clear perception that his actions could result in the loss of an innocent life. The fortune he had accumulated, all his assets and investments, seemed insignificant in the face of the possibility of not being able to save that child. In the days that followed, he mobilized all his contacts in the medical area. Through his network of relationships and unlimited financial resources, he managed to expedite the necessary tests to determine the compatibility of the possible donors. It was during this process that the most surprising discovery of the entire story came to light. The tests revealed that 3 of his own children were compatible for the transplant, including the child she was carrying in her womb. But the biggest revelation was discovering that this compatibility was not a coincidence of fate. Both carried a rare genetic condition, present in families originating from the same ancestral region. They were not direct relatives, but their lineages connected through past generations, explaining the surprising compatibility. The discovery completely changed both of their perspectives on what had happened between them. It wasn't just physical attraction or emotional connection that had united them that night on the yacht. It was as if fate had conspired to bring together 2 people who could save each other in ways they never imagined possible. The transplant was scheduled for the following week, with one of his 10-year-old children volunteering as a donor. During the preparations, they spent long hours together at the hospital, caring for the children and slowly rebuilding the lost trust. He discovered her extraordinary strength, how she had worked tirelessly to save her daughter, never victimizing herself even when she had every reason to hate him. She, in turn, began to see beyond the wealth and injured pride. She recognized a man who had also suffered deeply, who was genuinely sorry for his actions and willing to do anything to remedy the damage caused. The period in the hospital brought not only them closer, but also all the children, who began to form a true family. The surgery was a complete success. The little daughter, who for months had languished due to her medical condition and emotional stress, began to recover in a surprising way. The color returned to her face, her appetite normalized, and mainly, the genuine smile returned to her eyes. Seeing that transformation was the greatest reward they both could have received. During the months of recovery, he insisted on covering all medical and living expenses of the family, but he didn't stop there. He offered her an executive position in his company, recognizing the organizational and leadership skills she had demonstrated during the yacht party and throughout that ordeal. She accepted not out of dependence, but out of recognizing that she deserved an opportunity to rebuild her life professionally. Her transformation was remarkable. From a desperate cleaner, she became a respected executive, using her life experience to bring a human perspective to his business. Her innovative ideas for corporate events, combined with her deep understanding of people's needs, brought a new dimension to the company's operations. At the same time, the pregnancy progressed healthily. The child she was carrying in her womb represented not only the fruit of that magical night on the yacht, but also the definitive bridge between 2 families that fate had united. His 8 children, who had initially reacted with curiosity to the situation, soon adopted her as the maternal figure they had always wanted to have. The eldest daughter, who had been the catalyst for this entire transformation, became her greatest ally. The teenager admired the strength and determination she had demonstrated, seeing in her an example of how to face adversity without losing dignity. This special relationship helped to definitively integrate the 2 families. When the time of birth arrived, the entire extended family was present at the hospital. The baby was born healthy, without any sign of the genetic condition that had affected her older sister. It was as if the love that had developed between all of them had created a special protection around the new life. The 1-year period that marked this entire journey came to an end with an intimate ceremony on the same yacht where everything had begun. This time, it wasn't a business party, but a family celebration. The 9 children ran across the deck, their laughter echoing over the calm waters, while he and she watched with full hearts. They were united not only by the child they had conceived, but by a love built through suffering, forgiveness, and the understanding that sometimes the most important people in our lives arrive in the most unexpected moments. The man who once had built walls around his heart to protect himself now completely opened his life to a woman who had proven to be worthy of all his trust. The fortune he had accumulated in stocks and investments had finally found a greater purpose, not only to support a family, but to create a legacy of love and second chances. She, who had spent years struggling just to survive, now had not only financial security, but also the true love she had always deserved. As the sun set over the great city, painting the sky with golden hues that were reflected in the waters of the harbor, they knew that they had found not only each other, but also the cure for wounds they thought would never heal. The yacht sailed smoothly towards the horizon, carrying with it a family reunited by destiny and strengthened by the human capacity to forgive, start over, and truly love.